Excellent.
Guys, if you felt able to sit in these two sort of blocks in the front in a compact group, that would be great for me, because we can have a more, I hesitate to say intimate, but a more interactive conversation together than if you're spread out.
You want to say here for the? Oh yeah, let me see.
Yeah, so I'm going to wander around a bit, and I'll be mainly here. Is that all right? For the camera.
We have a fairly narrow camera view.
Okay. Well, can you move the camera?
Yeah, we can move the camera.
Okay. I'd prefer you to move the camera than to move me. I suppose we can move everybody over. Or one camera.
Too bad we don't have multiple cameras, huh? All right, excellent. All right, so I saw a version of this talk right when I started my PhD, and it gave me a lot to think about. I'm still working on trying to figure out how to write great research papers, so hopefully I'll get something more out of this talk as well.
Great.
So thanks so much, Simon, for coming out. So we've got Simon Peyton Jones giving this talk, How to Write a Great Research Paper, and thank you so much for your time, Simon.
Great. Okay. Very nice to see you all. Is it possible that you might sit with everybody else? I would love to sort of, but don't if it's a terrible social imposition, but it would be, I feel as if we're more likely to have a conversation together that way. Thank you. So yes, I now work for Epic Games. That's my day job, but I spend quite a lot of time on Haskell and GHC, actually also on computing education in the UK. But this talk is about the process of writing a paper, what to think about, and how to go about it. So, and I'm going to deliberately be somewhat opinionated. That is to say, I think this, right? But I'm acutely aware that nobody has a monopoly on truth, that there's lots of ways to write good papers, and that you may have observation and thoughts and questions that are completely valid, just different to what I think. So what I would love is that as we go along, in fact, I might even sort of sit myself down here, so we're all cozy, right? As we sort of with apologies to the screen, right? So that's still okay, just about. That we can, actually, I'll probably end up standing up again. If we could have a kind of conversation as we go, so it's not just a monologue by me, but is actually a dialogue with you, because this is something which we all need to think about. There's nobody knows the way to do this, right? This is the active communication from one human being to another. It is not amenable to like it's an act of proof, right? It's done. So please do me the honor of being interactive and not just sitting there. Okay? Okay. So let's see. What are we trying to do? Oh, beg your pardon. Oh, microphone. If you could put the microphone somewhere that's.
Pass the microphone around, so
Yeah, please do. Maybe you could sit with the microphone. Can somebody sit with the microphone in the middle so it's nearby everybody? Just sort of hand it to somebody, and then anybody who wants it can wave, and you can just keep an eye out. That would be great. I'll point, and I can always repeat questions as well, because there are online people who are. This is streaming, right? And we're trying to record it.
I think it's streaming in principle. I'm not sure if there's anybody.
Okay, but made.
It is recorded. So
Okay, so it's helpful if questions are yeah.
for the recording.
Yeah, great. Okay, and it can be comments as well as questions, right? So my advisor says this. What do you think? Okay, so the name of the game is how are we going to write a good paper? So and I've just been on the POPL program committee, so I have read a dozen 28-page highly technical papers, and I have to tell you, they're not great. The average level of exposition in many papers is not great. But the good news is that means that it's not hard for you to do better, right? And therefore to stand out as being a particularly attractive, accessible, well-written paper. So I think it's a skill. It's not just an innate thing. It's not just that some people are good at writing papers and some are not. I think it is a skill that you can learn. and engage in a feedback process that will enable you to do better, and that it's a skill that's worth learning. The most important reason it's worth learning is because it's a communication skill. The whole purpose of a paper is to communicate ideas between you and your audience, to engage in a dialogue with them, right? But it will also, by the way, get you lots of brownie points and get you promoted and get you jobs and all of those other good things, right? But the most important thing is it'll help communicate better. So, so let's see. Why am I looking at this? Why? Actually, I think I'm even completely. This is looking at the wrong. Where's my 7 simple lessons? I think this is the. Yep. Sorry about this. Right. So I'm going to make seven suggestions for things that you can do. So these are meant to be actionable things, right? 7 actionable things that you can remember. Number 1, don't wait, write. Okay, so here is a sort of standard model that I thought was, instinctively, nobody taught me this, but I thought this is what you do. You have an idea, you do, a month, a year of research on it, and then you write a paper. So the paper is like the printer, it's the output device for your research, right? I don't think that's true at all. I think it's much better to have the idea and to start writing the paper right away. And that then shows you the things that you don't understand and tells you what research to do. Right? But look at do you see how big the difference is here? Right? Research, for me, writing a paper is not the output device. It's almost the means of doing research. Why do I say that? It's because it forces, when you write a paper, you are forced to say the contributions of this work is this, right? You're forced to explain the background and the key ideas of the paper. And in doing so, that brings to the surface the fact, actually, I don't really understand what the contributions are, or I can't really I can't tell you how often I've had the experience of starting to write a paper and thinking, I don't really understand this as well as I thought. It has to be simpler. In some ways, maybe the whole quest of research is a quest for simplicity, and that is brought to the surface when you write a paper and you think, it's just embarrassing to explain something that's as complicated and as ad hoc and as unprincipled as what I've ended up with here. So the other thing is that it's really helpful in opening the way to a dialogue with others, right? If you want to talk to other people about your research, and for me, that's a big way in which I do research, you need to have something that they can interact with. And of course, you can tell them in a few words at a conference conversation, but it's bound to be superficial. To communicate at a deeper level about the actual content of your research, having it written down is really helpful. So it enables a dialogue. So here's my headline summary, is that papers are not the output device. They are part of the very fabric of doing research, right? It is not a means to just impress people. It is not a means to get publications on your CV, though it will do those things too. It is a means to help you crystallize and explore and engage in dialogue with your ideas. Okay, that's point number 1. Yes, please. Microphone, just pass the microphone quickly. Maybe run about with it very fast. Yeah, good, thank you.
Have this random thought. There's this thing called test-driven development, but I think your thing can be summarized as paper-driven research.
Very good. What a great thing. I'm going to retitle that thing, yes. Paper-driven research. I think that's very close, yes. And I don't practice entirely what I preach. I do wait a little bit before starting to write the paper, but it's what I discover is that I waited too long. And yep, anybody else? Okay, Dan.
Simon, I think just writing the introduction is really, really helpful because it forces you to make these bullet points, like what problem do I solve and what do I need to still do right in the research. So I think it's a little discouraging to hear you say, you have to start writing the whole paper. That's a lot, but just writing introduction would already be a great driver.
Yes, that's right. Writing the introduction can be a bit sort of, the contributions, the list of contributions, that's a helpful thing to write. And you have to keep, I'm going to say more about that, you have to keep iterating it. But another way to think of it is, imagine that you're explaining this to somebody in detail on a whiteboard. What would you do? I'll say more about that in a second. But yes, you don't need to write the whole paper. Just get something out there. Yes, please.
So if you start to write the paper before you know what the research will turn out to, don't you end up with a lot of drafts that didn't work out?
Well, of course, you're going to make claims that you cannot yet substantiate. But that's very helpful. That's like test-driven development. You write tests that fail, right? And that says, oh shit, I better do some research to substantiate that claim. And then either you do or you don't. You discover that, but the wonderful thing about research is that even if you don't, you try to substantiate the claim. Turns out, it's like, the wonderful thing about research is, in industry, when you're asked to do a task and there's an obstacle, right, you walk towards the obstacle, there's an obstacle, and you have to climb over it or tunnel under it or make sellotape and string, somehow bodge around to get past it, to get to that destination. With research, you can say, ooh, that's an interesting obstacle. That's a new research problem. And you turn right through 90 degrees and you see how long is the wall and what shape it is. And do you see what I mean? Actually, that's a wonderful thing. So even claims that you fail to substantiate can be interesting in their own right. It's a glory of research. Somebody else? Yes, please. Run the microphone over, please. Thank you. Super swift. This is great. Yeah.
Okay, so when you say you have to write a paper before you do research, like at the beginning, do you mean it's almost like a brain dump?
It's almost like a brain. Is it almost like a brain dump? Yes, I mean I'm overstating a bit, obviously, right? But I do mean that you're going to write down a paper that says you're going to start writing, say the contributions of this work are going to be this, and I'm going to show that I can compile this program 20% faster than anybody else or something. So of course you haven't proved that yet,
right.
But now yes. So and then you might indeed brain dump some of your ideas about how to do it, yes, and they're not going to be very fully formed yet, but it's a start. If you're explaining to somebody else. Yes, please, behind you.
I was thinking about this approach now, and what comes to mind is when you're writing a paper, do you think it could come to like some unintentional like assumptions that are kind of biased, and as you're going along with your research, you're not really allowing that open flow of ideas because you've written it down and you're kind of trying to go along with it, like fit it into your paper, as opposed to like doing the opposite, starting with the research, having this big thing, and then kind of like narrowing it down with the paper?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, except to say that it sounds bad to narrow down, but at the same time, if you try to boil the ocean, you will fail, right? So that a lot of research succeeds mainly because it's chosen a problem that's not solved, but is sufficiently constrained that you can actually make some progress with it. And then if there's a grander picture that then begins to open up to you, say, I could generalize it in that way, then you can write another paper. So you're not wrong, but I do think there's a danger of just flailing around for a long time in a general kind of area without actually making progress with anything. And I feel as if that's the greater danger, typically. But, yeah. Yes, please.
Is there a certain point at which you can say, okay, I think my research is probably not going to fail, so now I can like write stuff down? I'm thinking of a semester where I spent an entire semester doing research, and we ran into dead end after dead end, and like didn't ever get anywhere. So like for that, in that case, like any time I spent writing a paper about it, like it wouldn't have gone anywhere.
No, so starting to write a paper early doesn't guarantee that you'll get results of any kind. I mean, then it's in the nature of research that by definition, we are daily confronting our own inadequacy, right? I spend most of my time thinking, Simon, if only you were a bit cleverer, you could solve this problem. But of course, the thing is, if I could solve it and it was easy, then it wouldn't be research anymore, and I'd move on and find a problem that I couldn't solve. Research is by its nature, you're always struggling with your own inadequacy. And some of the time, it will be a problem that is just too hard for that moment for you. And that's none of this talk will help you with that, but it might help you detect that a little earlier, perhaps. If you spent a year investing in that before discovering that would not be so good. But it doesn't solve the underlying problem, I agree. Yeah.
I want to just add a comment from like recent experience where like I spent an entire year trying to like push this project and like not knowing where to go. Then like I had to like finally write it up for something and showed it to someone, and he looked at my paper for like 15 minutes and went like, "You're trying to like write the wrong paper. Like your paper is about this different thing.
Uh-huh.
And like now I can actually push forward. So like it really helps in like
So help because
sharing.
you expressed it in written form that somebody else could interact with and say,
Yeah.
oh, but you're really with it. Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
like that's probably
Whereas as long as it was just a mess within your head, nobody else could help you. Yeah. Thank
yeah,
you.
I remember
That's a great experience.
Dr. Ivan Sutherland said that like ideas are not ideas yet until you've written it down.
Yes, in fact, that's a very nice segue into point number 2. This is actually really good, by the way. If we don't get to the end of it, if we run out of time before we got to all 7, I'm fine with that because I love having a conversation with you much more. Okay, but we're going to keep racing on. So, idea. So you're talking about what is the idea. So for me, this point number 2 is identify your key idea. Right? This is a bit what Dan was talking about writing an introduction. So, what is the goal of a research paper? So what is her name? Segev. Am I pronouncing it right? Right. So, if I write a paper that you're reading, my goal is to convey some reusable idea from my head into yours. Right, so the paper is like one of those delivery drug mechanisms. You know, they wrap up a drug in something and it goes into your bloodstream and it gets to your liver and then it pops open and delivers its payload. So the paper is the mechanism that delivers into your brain, poof, a payload that conveys an idea. And I think I said reusable idea because, you know, it's not like what I did last summer, which is not really of interest to you, right? Unless you're very interested in me and my family, right? It's the idea. The point about conveying an idea is you might be able to make use of that idea. So you want to convey a reusable idea from your head into the mind of somebody else. So, and we spend a lot of time building artifacts, and computer science is very much about building artifacts and programs. But in the end, papers, the ideas are more durable than those artifacts. So Mozart is my favorite example, right? So Mozart didn't write papers, he wrote music. But nevertheless, hundreds of years after his death, we go to concert halls to listen to people read his papers. Well, actually, it's musicians playing his music. And of course, there's a tremendous amount that the musicians themselves are doing. But nevertheless, if people went to hear readings of my papers in 400 years' time, that would be pretty wild, right? And yet, so that's an incredibly durable artifact that Mozart created. Isn't it? Just think, hundreds of years later, that sequence of notes that he wrote is still being re-expressed and articulated. I just think it's amazing. So, and to your, somebody made a comment that said, yes, the greatest ideas are almost literally worthless unless you communicate them. If they remain locked up in your head, right, they haven't benefited the world, and not even you very much either, right? So, okay, so, but when it comes to ideas, here's a fallacy that I want you to think about, that one of the most confidence-sapping things is you look at all these other papers and they all seem to be full of amazing ideas by very clever people. Whoa, I wish I'd thought of that. And you think, my idea today, that is a pitiful, worm-like, incremental idea, barely worth explaining to anybody else. Right? We all have imposter syndrome. Everybody else seems to be cruising along on the surface of where we're just struggling to stay afloat, right? But let me tell you, that is universal. Everybody feels like that, right? I'm sitting there, the paper did get into ICFP finally about verse. I'm going to give a presentation on Thursday, but it was rejected by Popple a year and a half ago. And I spent the time thinking, has it really got anything new? Is it terribly incremental? Everybody thinks this, right? So the fallacy is you need a good idea before you can write a paper. And I think that you should actually start to write about any idea, no matter how pitiful, because often it turns out to be more interesting than you expect. So that's my usual experience, is that something that seems quite simple and small turns into something more interesting by the time I've worked out the detail in a paper. Occasionally, it turns out it really was a fairly pitiful idea. But even then, it was made better by writing it down, and then maybe I'll publish it as a workshop, or even maybe just on my homepage, right? And I've got a few unpublished papers there that never made it into them. But it was better from writing it down. So all I'm saying is, it's not a good reason not to write a paper because you think your idea is not very clever yet. Just get on with it anyway. And if it's very simple and so forth, you write the paper quickly and be done. You can move on. Okay. Any questions, observations about that? Because that's kind of super important. This whole imposter syndrome thing is really important, and I just want to reassure you, it's not just research students who feel this. I'm 65 and I still feel it. Yes. Right front, yeah.
First of all, you don't look 65. You don't look.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I. But I am anyway.
So
Thank you.
This imposter
Oh, you meant that I look 70? I think it's on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're talking about this imposter syndrome thing in computer science, and I'm a TA, and I see a lot of it in my students and in myself. How did you break out of the imposter syndrome, and did it take you like hitting your head on the same wall 10 times before you realized it's just everyone?
I don't really know how to break out of imposter syndrome, except number one thing is just to have just to listen to the people like me who are telling you we all feel this, right? This is just common to being human. So that you're not unusual or weird for feeling like an imposter. And I suppose then another part of it, I suppose, is a bit to do with people who, like me, are exhibitionists at heart, just have an easier time. Because it's not so hard for us to put something out there and then people shoot it down or saying that's not very clever. And I think, well, fine, you may think that, but I think it's great. Whereas other personalities may find that kind of critique harder. And I think I think you probably need to talk to other people than me to know how to deal with that from a position of greater vulnerability. I feel as if I'm privileged because I've never found that particular part difficult. But I do know that it's something that we all have to grapple with. I know that for sure. And I know that because there are lots of different personality types, I think if you talk to other colleagues, maybe senior colleagues in your department, and kind of try to have an honest conversation with them, I'm sure that they will tell you the same thing. And some of them may be able to give you more sort of emotionally connected advice than I'm able to do so online here. Does that make sense? But the number one thing is don't be ground down by imposter syndrome. Everybody feels it. It is something that I believe everybody can overcome. Yeah.
I was just going to add something to the imposter syndrome thing. Like, yeah, it doesn't go away for anybody, but one of the things that helped me was finding a bunch of people who keep insisting that actually I'm rather intelligent and that my ideas are cool sometimes and that I'm doing good work. And that's pretty helpful. So a lot of time it's just who you surround yourself with, I think.
And maybe even writing a paper could help because, hey, it might get accepted. And that's actually a pretty big, adrenaline shot when it does. Dan and Benjamin, have you got any? I mean, you can maybe reflect. I mean, another senior colleagues in the room, so I think we can have input from all sorts of people. Yes,
junior, Simon. I'm not 50.
Getting more.
Just saying. Look. But I think a really cool thing is you said it already, but often you have like a small idea, or I do have small ideas, and then I start writing about it, and then they turn out to be more interesting than you first thought, and you actually get a really interesting paper suddenly with lots of insights that people love to read, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really helps to overcome, like we really study your small problem, and writing a paper, helps you guide that study, right? And I've seen that many times in my own publications. I don't know.
Yeah, at the back here.
So, is this on? My two cents. The first one is, imposter syndrome is a symptom that you're aiming high. It's a good sign. It means that you're aiming higher than where you feel comfortable. You're pushing yourself. So it's not something that should discourage you. It's a signal that you're doing the right thing. That's my perception. And the other thing that I would like to say is, in terms of papers, when I felt that way, and when I would write a paper and send it somewhere and felt like it may be rejected and I feel like I don't belong here and so on, what made a difference for me was to feel that it's not about the paper getting accepted. It's about having a conversation with the reviewers. That's what the review process is about, and getting their feedback.
We're going to talk about review feedback very shortly, yes. Thank you, but it's a good point. Yeah, Benjamin?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for the, what was it? Your first point was, it's a signal you're doing the right thing. And that's a bit what I was saying about we're confronting our inadequacies all the time, because that's what research is. So I think super important. Thank you, Ben.
My best trick does not always work, but to the extent possible, get your attention off of what other people are thinking of you and on to enjoying the work that you're doing.
Good advice, just hard to follow.
No, it is hard to follow, but sometimes I succeed in actually literally saying that to myself, you know? I'm spending a lot of time wondering what other people are thinking about this thing that I'm doing, but actually it's interesting anyway, so why not just do it?
It makes sense. When you just have fun, when you don't care about the outcome, makes more sense that it will go.
Yeah, good. Okay. Good, let's move on. This, by the way, is just saying what Dan said, right? That the paper usually turns out to be more interesting and challenging than you expected. Okay, but do try to identify what, we talked about the key idea. It is very helpful when you're writing a paper and when you're reading one to know what the key idea is, right? So the next time you're reading a paper, when you finished it, ask yourself, what is the key idea in that paper? And sometimes you will know, and often you will not. And if you don't, that's not your fault, that's the author's fault. It's up to the author to say, this is the key idea, right? There should be, so every paper should have a sentence that says, this is the key idea of this paper, right? Make no mistake, it's like, pay attention now. So this is a colleague I knew called it, this is a quote from The Hunt for Red October, when Marius the captain says, he's doing a little echo. He says, just one ping. So you're just out. If you have a paper that has several good ideas in it and you're struggling to fit them all in, write several papers. That's fine, right? Don't try to pack too much in. Okay, where are we? Yes, and make sure the reader knows what it is. And the best way to do it is to say, the key idea is this. Okay, so oh, no, comment here. Thank you.
So I wonder, so in many system papers, it seems like there are many good ideas and like all of them are within one paper. Is it because like systems papers are different, or it's because like they are just badly written?
This is systems papers that have many ideas. Sometimes there's a little collection of ideas. Each individually is not terribly exciting, perhaps, but together they work together to do something remarkable. That's fine, right? And maybe the systems paper you're thinking about are like that. Sometimes they're just sort of unrelated ideas, somehow wedged into one paper because the author had them all and thought, I'm writing a paper in that, but put them all in. But then it becomes so compressed, it's like Belgian chocolate, indigestible. Then you might want to think about writing several papers. It's hard to generalize, but at least knowing. So do this exercise. When you next read a paper, when you finish it, think, what is the reusable idea that was conveyed into my brain? It should by now be infecting my neurons, right? Is it? What was it? But if you don't know what it was, it can't infect your neurons. Okay? All right, yes. Please, microphone again, thank you.
So I know that a lot of folks probably won't get too deep into a paper that they're reading.
Yeah.
Some like pingy ideas might not make sense without like a decent chunk of background. How do you even make it ping without giving it the foundation?
Very good. So that's a lovely segue. So how are you going to present your paper in such a way as to convey this idea? Yes. So my story here is tell a narrative of some kind. So the one thing I'd suggest you remember is imagine that you are talking to a friend in front of a whiteboard and that you have their attention for, let's say, half an hour, not just, 3 minutes, right, over a glass of sherry, but a good half hour with an actual whiteboard, and they really want to understand something. What would you do, right? Would you start with theorem 2.7.9? No, you probably wouldn't. You would give some, you would say, here is the problem that I'm trying to solve. Here is why it's an interesting and unsolved problem. Both of those aspects are important, right? And then you'd say, and here is my idea for trying to solve it. And you would do that in some intuitive way, right? And then you would probably say, and now I've given you a rough idea. Now I need to explain a few more details so that you could actually, ideally, they should be able to reproduce the idea themselves. And then you need to say a bit about how other people's ideas approach. So here, you want to make them, first of all, think, whoa, I wish I could solve that problem. I don't know how to solve it, but I could see that it'd be really cool to solve it. And then they would sort of salivate at the mouth and say, oh, that's very, very clever. Let me see a bit more details. But all the time you're trying to draw them in further. So this drug delivery mechanism isn't actually a sort of yes or no thing. It's more like you suck them in. And at each stage, they can't quite let go of your paper. That's the goal. Right, so here's a typical structure for the paper that I would write with this. So I want to say a bit about abstract in a second. Introduction, we'll say a bit about that. Then a statement of the problem you're trying to solve, right? Because until you know the problem you're trying to solve, you can't do much. Then a short statement of what the idea is, so short and intuitive, right? Supported by examples. Then details that expands it into something. So the idea is that anytime anybody falls off the horse, they stop reading, they come away with something useful. They haven't just waded through 3 pages of preliminary definitions, right? And they got tired, and then they've benefited nothing, right? You want to send them away with something useful at every stage. So let me say a little bit more about this structure. So this structure here, I'm just going to, then the next few points are about the structure. So first thing is about introduction, which is about contributions, right? So in the introduction thing, the thing that Dan was saying about, I think you should describe the problem you're trying to solve and state your contributions, right? And to do so in, around, depending on the particular medium, around a page or a couple of pages of ACM sort of conference format, right? So, but no more than that. So first of all, describe the problem. So I would always describe the problem starting as early as possible with an example. Here is a paper that I wrote some time ago, and you can see typewriter font on page 1. I often judge papers that I'm reviewing by, is there any typewriter font? Because typewriter font usually means here's some code, an actual example, right, of something that the paper is supposed to do. So introducing with a concrete example can be very helpful to motivate your problem. And the other thing about stating the problem is you don't want to state problems that are too ambitious. So this is a much more common mistake, I think, than stating problems that are too simple, right? So it's like this. If I describe to you Mount Everest, right, say, that's an interesting and important problem, right, and you think, well, yes, it is, but you're going to die in the foothills, right? You haven't got a clue about how to get up that, right? So, so wildly aspirational statements of the problem are no help. I gave a particular example here. Computer programs have bugs. It's important to eliminate these bugs, blah, 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 Many researchers have tried, blah, blah, blah. It really would be great. Are you any the wiser after this paragraph, despite all its citations? You're not, right? It's just guff, right? Whereas if you say, here is a particular program with a subtle bug, right? And I'm going to show you this, and this subtle bug is an example of a class of subtle bugs, and I'm going to show you a static analysis that can eliminate this entire class. Now I'm kind of more interested, right? So, because you've described not Mount Everest, all bugs, but a little foothill, a particular class of bugs that you can actually nail. Do you see the difference, right? So that's really helpful when framing the problem, is to try, it's not always easy to do, is to frame a problem that is clearly interesting, but not so ambitious as to be yawn-worthy, right? Because surprisingly, very ambitious scope is very yawn-worthy, right? Does not motivate the reader. Okay, so I call it molehills, not mountains. And then contributions, so this is still in the introduction, right? So I would always suggest that in your introduction section, you have something that's tantamount to saying the contributions of this paper are as follows, and then list them. And I always list them with bullet points, right? So there's no doubt about what I think my contributions are. Moreover, I think it can be very helpful in the bullet points here to give forward references to the section. So each point makes a claim. I think I say this on the next slide. Do I? Yes, each bullet point makes a claim and gives forward reference to later in the paper where you substantiate that claim, right? This is very good for either absent section discovery, which is that you say you make a claim and you actually turn out there isn't any evidence in the paper to support it, or dead code elimination, because you discover there's a whole section that doesn't appear in your contributions and it actually isn't terribly necessary to the main payload of the paper. So, yes. So being clear what the contributions are, don't let the referee be in any doubt, and I would suggest bulleting them to begin with. Maybe you'll change your style, maybe your style's different, that's fine, but it should be clear what they are. Contribution 1, contribution 2, contribution 3, forward references. And try to make them refutable. It's surprising how often people make claims that cannot be refuted. we will, we will show a calculus and study its properties. I mean, I can't deny that you studied its properties, right? But why? That wasn't, what did it achieve? So, we described the WSWAS system. Well, you can describe it, but why is the world a better place for the existence of the WSWAS system? So you want to make claims that you think would be of interest and that it is possible to fail at. Right? That's what I mean by refutable. That it is possible in some universe that you fail to deliver evidence that that claim is true. Okay? That makes a much more satisfying set of contributions than as it were, what I did last summer. Right? Here is a description of my journey, which is not directly of interest to anybody. Okay? Have I got anything else to say here? Yes. And I would suggest that by using forward references, you don't need that paragraph that so often occurs. When you read that paragraph in the introduction, at the end of the introduction, there's often a paragraph that says, the rest of this paper is structured as follows. In section 2, we do this. In section 3, we do this. When you read that paragraph, does your blood begin to pound in your veins? Do you think, how exciting section 3 is going to be about this? You do not. You skip that whole paragraph. And that whole paragraph is part of the introduction. The introduction, remember, is like the gold dust. That is the bit that most readers will read. Because, I forgot to mention that, didn't I? Back up here in your, here. Look at what happens to your readership. Lots of people read the title. A few people read the abstract and maybe the introduction. Now you're down by a factor of 10, right? So the introduction is like golden text. Every word in that deserves more polish and attention than the stuff later in the paper, because it's going to attract and keep more readers. But don't think that it means you have to write it first necessarily, though I'd encourage you to write a draft of the contributions first. I think you should endlessly review and polish that introduction. It's very difficult to write a good introduction straight off. Start with it, yes, but don't be afraid to iterate it. And don't spend too long trying to get it right on the first iteration, because you won't. Okay, I think that's all I was going to say about the sort of introduction and contributions, is it? Yes. Good. Anything else about sort of introduction, setting up your story? I'm trying to address your question about, this hasn't really talked about how to convey the idea, but it has talked about setting up the problem. Not too long, not too long. Yeah, please.
Earlier today, we heard that there are different styles of reading a paper. So, for example, some people like to jump around. They might read the introduction at first, but then they'll skip around to different sections and pick out the parts that are the most interesting or applicable to the thing they're working on. How common do you think that is, and how valuable is it, do you think, to be able to pick up a paper wherever you want and start reading it and still get the gist of it?
So I think, on the whole, I think that the jumping around style imposes, certainly relying on readers to do that, imposes a tax on the reader. So your dominant cost model should be the cost model for a reader who reads it linearly, right? Be sympathetic to your audience, right? If you say, well, if you had any sense as a reader, of course you would have known to start with section 4, right? But if that's what you think, put section 4 first, right? So optimize for readers who are following a linear sequence. But at the same time, there are things, I didn't put this in this talk, but I really like it when people put reference material in figures. Take the syntax, the BNF for your programming language, stick it in a figure, constantly refer to figure 3, so that when you're flicking back later, you say, darn it, what are all the constructs in this language? You can find it easily. If it's embedded, particularly a little bit here and a little bit here, in running text, it can be hard to find. So it's really good to structure your paper in such a way that it's easy to flick around, particularly to figures, but I wouldn't optimize for that reading, the jumping around reading pattern. Anyone else? Okay. So did you have a question or observation? Were you waving? No. Okay. That was just a little wiggle of the eyebrows. All right. Yes. Right. Related work. Right. What often happens is then you think, well, it's good scholarship. I've set up the problem I'm trying to solve, and the next thing I should, of course, do is to tell you about about the giants on whose shoulders I stand. Right. The related work section, and that not universally these days, but quite often appears early in the paper. But I think that's a mistake. Right? I think your advisor may differ from me on this point, and you'll have to dialogue with him or her about that. But here, I think often that related work stands as an obstacle in between your poor reader and your idea, right? So the drug delivery mechanism is coming along and you stick a wall in the way and the poor reader is trying to think, moreover, then the related work section, you're trying to do a job of explaining what other people have done. But at that stage, you haven't got very much intellectual scaffolding erected. So it's quite difficult to understand this related work, all right? But see, you haven't got the vocabulary yet. And moreover, because you know that it's getting between the reader and the idea, you tend to compress it. So you take something that should take 5 pages and you compress it to 2.5 or 2, and then it becomes impenetrable, even to somebody who knows the subject. So even to an expert who already knows all this related work, it becomes difficult going. To somebody who's just reading the paper because they were trying to learn about your idea, it's discouraging. All right, so my suggestion would be, put the related work at the later. I've just said this. Put the related work later in the paper, right? So later in the paper, you have given your narrative, you've explained your idea, you've introduced the concept, you've introduced lots of examples, and now you have lots of vocabulary and intellectual scaffolding and stuff that makes the related work much easier to explain. And moreover, you have something to compare with, namely what you presented. Please, at the back. Yeah. Where's my? Oh, you've got the microphone ready. Great.
Sometimes you read papers where there's a lot of related work in the introduction to like motivate the problem. Like, okay, like this person did this, but like it sucks if you try to do it with subtyping, and this person did this, but it sucks for other thing. What do you think about like that?
So in that case, imagine your friend with the whiteboard, right? So you're trying to set up your problem. If in a natural explanation of the problem, you would say, well, you might think that you could do this, but it just doesn't work. You might think you could do this, and by the way, that was done by Brown and out. So your point is not, first I have to tell you about brown and white. Your motivation, first, I have to explain why this idea, which you might think was obvious, doesn't work out. If it's part of a natural exposition, then yes, do that. But it's part of the exposition that leads the reader by the shortest and most, pain-free route to the point at which they can understand and appreciate your idea. So the motivation is different. The motivation is not, I'm trying to tell you about everything in the field. The motivation is, I'm trying to show you why this is, I'm trying to help you to understand how this idea works. You see what I mean? So it may well involve quite a bit related work. And by the way, you should have, whenever in the expository start, you come across a bit of your exposition, which to a well-informed reader would say, isn't that a bit like, Felicin and Wright, 1922? No, that's a bit early even. Then you should give a forward reference. You should say, cite their work and say, and maybe mention that in section 6.2 you'll discuss it. So lots of forward references to related work and citations totally acknowledge the giants on whose you're standing, but in an incidental way until you get there. That would be my advice. Okay? Now, how are we doing? We are out of time.
Take as long as you need. No, we're just doing speed mentoring after this, so it's very flexible. So
okay.
We're not on a,
Oh, we're actually on number 5, aren't we? So we've only got 2 more to go. Okay? This is fun? Yeah? Okay. Any other observations so far about related work? Yes. Yes. I've got one more thing to say about related work, which is that when you do get to the related work section, like towards the end of your paper, it's sounding a bit echoey all of a sudden. Is it okay for you? No, it's fine. There's a kind of fallacy that feels that you have to say in your related work bit, well, our system does this, so Felicin and Wright did that, but actually their work is, completely hopeless because it doesn't do this, and ours is way better, right? So it's as if you have to diss everybody else to make yourself look good. But in research, credit is not really like that. So so here's a $20 note, right? So if it has got louder. Something weird is happening. It's sounding much more echoey to me. No, maybe I'll move this down a bit to be less echoey. Is that all right? Can you still hear me? Okay. So if I give this $20 to Jasper, hero Jasper, temporarily, right? So now. Jasper is $20 richer, and I am $20 poorer. But if instead I give Jasper love, right, then, because he's my friend and I've known him all my life on all of that, right, then am I poorer for giving love to Jasper? No. Love is this amazingly, infinitely divisible substance that you could make more of simply by giving away more of it. Isn't that incredible? Right? It's like a magic, it's like the widow's cruse. The more you give away, the more you have. Very unlike money. And credit is like that. So when you, not in a obsequious way, but when you give credit to the people whose work you've built this upon, you can say, take a moment to say, in their inspiring paper, blah, blah, blah. Or just say something nice about it. Of course, if you feel that, right? Because often you do feel that, actually, that paper really did open my eyes. It was eye-opening paper. Just say something nice. And take a moment to think, how could I, frame my positive feelings about this paper? Because it was an eye-opener for me. Then it doesn't do you any harm. In fact, it does you some good. I shall take back my money now. It's just, everybody wins. Everybody wins, right? So, but somehow it's only human to feel a bit instinctively that I have to tell them how bad everybody else's work is. Of course, you can criticize their work and say, actually, it did have this problem, as they acknowledged or didn't acknowledge. And by the way, you should acknowledge shortcomings in your own work too, and say, here's something that we don't do that they do better. That's incredible. It's much better if you say that than if your referees say that, right? So, and it's also academically true. If your work is not as good on some axis, but is better on others, if you say that, then people can have a more fair evaluation of what's going on, know when to pick your idea over some other idea. But it's just terrible if somebody else points that out in a review. Very, very destructive. So it's better on all axes. Okay, acknowledge weaknesses. Yes. Yes, at the back.
Take into account that some of the people who read your papers and review them may be the authors of the very same papers that you're criticizing.
Yeah. Of course, that's a tactical point, but nevertheless an important one.
You don't need. I'm agreeing with your point. You don't need to be so critical.
Yeah.
You can just acknowledge that.
Yeah. But you don't need to be. You don't need to be. What's the word?
Bootlicking.
Yes, bootlicking. Yes. Yes, you don't need to, oh, dear reviewer, I know you're going to be reviewing this. Your paper was fantastic, You just need to say what's on your heart, but take a moment to say it in a slightly more, emotionally laden way. Or yes, I think, because we're a community of people working together to add to human knowledge. Okay, enough on related work then. So I've got two more things to say, right? Number 6. Put your readers first. What does that mean? That means in this section, right, have a care for the reader. So first thing is try to avoid this kind of introduction. The first time you get into the technical material, it starts with an utterly intimidated section, thing like this. And your readers who up to now have been thinking, whoa, I'd really be able to solve that. They read this sentence, they go, okay, this paper is not for me, right? So try to avoid it, even though, because what tends to happen is you first of all understand something intuitively, then you find some generalization, right? And then, stupidly, you present the generalization as the main idea, right? Of course, that's where you're trying to get them, but if you present it first, it's terribly off-putting because it's much harder to understand generalization. So instead, back to the whiteboard, you would not do this to your friend, right? You would start with an example, right? You would explain intuitively the idea, and you'd gradually build up to the general case. So start with specifics and examples, and build up to generalities. That'd be my advice in the narrative, right? And so wherever the reader falls off the horse, they've taken something valuable with them, some intuition. Intuition is primary, right? And therefore examples are primary. As examples are the way that you convey intuition. I think so. Yes, I keep saying this, don't I? Examples, examples, examples. Intuition, intuition, intuition. A research paper, does need to carry the actual detailed payload somehow. You may end up finding that somehow some of it has to be in an appendix even. But if you only have the deep intellectual payload and general results, but no intuition, your readership will be very small, so its impact will be limited, right? It's very important to keep that intuitive stuff in. Right, and so here's an example, right? An example of using an example early. And the other big thing I want to suggest that you avoid is recapitulating your personal journey, right? You were describing here multiple dead ends, right? So if you lead your reader by the hand and you say, let's go this way, And then, a page later, after lots of Greek symbols and heavy-duty stuff, you say, that turned out to be a bad idea. Let's not do that. Right, so then you say, okay, let's try this other thing. The whole point is you're trying to lead them by the hand towards the path to the solution that you found. So don't recapitulate your journey. Unless the only reason I think it's helpful to describe failing approaches is like if you're walking with somebody by the hand and there's a doorway to the right into this glorious sunshine with lit fields and dancing unicorns, and you just say, well, we're going this way, and you're thinking, but look, the unicorns are over there. Right? Then that could be very distracting for a reader, right? Because you think, why didn't you do the obvious thing? So then you probably do need to say, you might think you could do this, but it just doesn't work. And either I'm going to tell you now why it doesn't work, or I'll tell you later when we've got more vocabulary. But don't worry, I've got you by the hand. I know that the unicorns look as if they're there, but they're just mirages. I'm going to show you now or later. Right? But that's the only way in which I would lead you down. The trouble is, of course, that the route was expensive to you and was an important part of your personal journey. And so it's hard not to write about it. But it doesn't help the reader, and they are not interested in your blood. Okay? It's obvious, really, but it's, surprisingly often this happens in papers. And it's really irritating as a reader to discover that you have slaved away for half an hour of review time trying to learn something that turned out to be not the approach that they were taking. Last thing, listening to readers. This is to do with reviewing, which you were mentioning, right? So you really want to get, it's very difficult to write a paper without getting feedback. So you want to get feedback from as many people as possible. So you need to identify your guinea pigs, right? Your guinea pigs are friends, not necessarily experts, who will commit to reading your paper with some care. Now, you need to educate them in what you want. Most people, if you ask, could you read my paper, they will come back to you and say, on page 3, I think you could do with a comma after that phrase, or this word is misspelt. You don't want any of that, right? You can do that at the very final stage. What you want is them to say, I just got lost at the end of page 2. But they will not say that to you unless you carefully educate them that that is the main thing you want for them, because they feel bad for you, right? They don't want to tell you that they got lost, right? They want to tell you nice things about your paper. So you have to carefully ask them to say, where did you get lost? And then try to get them to explain why they got lost. And then with the whiteboard, you can say, oh, blah, blah, blah. And they say, oh, now I understand. And then you can say, okay, so I should have said that. Because often you discover that what you simply say spontaneously to explain their misconception or their difficulty turns out to be a better exposition in the first place. We often do better on the fly in front of a whiteboard with a friend than we do in writing. Right, so listen to yourself. Right, good. But of course, your guinea pigs, you have to use them sparingly, right? If you inject all of your guinea pigs at once with the first draft, they all roll over dead and tell you similar things, right? But then you've got no more guinea pigs for the next iteration. So use your guinea pigs up, one by one, or in little small batches, right? And then from them, from your guinea pigs or from your reviewers, this was your point. You need to treat all feedback as gold dust. So the first thing to remember is that, what did I say? The bottom thing here. Reviewers have given you a commodity that is precious to them and that they can never get back. And that commodity is their time, right? Rich or poor, clever or stupid, male or female, the whole, everybody is allotted 24 hours a day. And, it's a fixed income economy. And they have given you, half an hour, 2 hours of their time that they will never have back. It is a gift that they have made to you. So that's one good reason for being truly grateful. And the other reason for being truly grateful is if a reviewer has got stuck on some aspect of your paper and says, I didn't understand that, or they just made a misconception. They criticize you for a reason that's completely bogus, right? Then your response should not be, you stupid reviewer, you simply willfully misunderstood my paper, right? You should, or you're just not clever enough to have understood my very clever idea, right? You want to say, how could I rewrite that paragraph, that section, so that not even this stupid reviewer could misunderstand it in that way, right? This is easy to say. It's also really hard to execute on, because when you get those reviews that say your paper has been rejected, you are bruised and bleeding, right? And you just think they have no taste, right? They just don't see the genius here. Right, or else you feel bruised and bleeding because you think, well, you know, I am a worm after all, right? But I don't think I'll say any more about this. Just that this is a skill that is hard to cultivate. But if you just keep saying yourself, it's a bit like Benjamin was saying earlier. Keep saying this to yourself, that when you get those reviews, you've got to think every piece of feedback is, you know, a little piece of gold dust if I can treat it as a way to improve my paper rather than as a way to be upset about my referee. Not easy advice. Okay, so I think this is it. These are 7 actionable points about writing papers. Yes, please, microphone, Kale. So now we're just into general discussion. We can stop whenever you like. Yeah.
Are there like good and bad paper titles? Like, are there like good and bad practices?
Oh, good and bad practices in paper titles.
Yes, or is it just straightforward?
Yes, no, paper titles are not entirely straightforward, because paper titles, you know, are the initial, in fact, in the list of contents, I said paper title, 1,000 readers, you know, abstract and introduction, 100, right? So the paper title might draw your readers in.
Exactly.
I'm in favor generally of titles that are a bit longer and a bit more expository, so that they say, you know, the paper that I've got on Thursday is called something like the verse calculus, a core calculus for deterministic functional logic programming. So the sort of second phrase kind of expands on the first. It is possible. Some people are brilliant at inventing clever titles. Like my favorite one is Pat Helen's paper, whose title is this, which is great for ICFP: Immutability changes everything. Don't you think that's lovely, right? So functional programming, all about immutable values, but it just transforms the way you think about the world. A 3-word title, brilliant. But I can't invent titles like that, so mine tend to be more prosaic. But I think it is worth thinking a bit about, maybe, again, getting help from your guinea pigs to say, what would draw somebody in? Or maybe the title is just too short and you don't get enough from it to know what the paper's about, and so to know whether you should read it. Yes, San Francisco. Here, I can run with it. Thanks.
Yeah, so the talk was called How to Write Good Research, and I was wondering, like, how do you know...
Keep it close to you. No, it is on, but keep it close to you.
I was wondering, how do you know if your idea is actually any good?
Oh, how do you know if your research? Well, you can write a paper and see if it gets accepted. No, but partly it's, I don't think you will ever know if your idea is any good by just thinking about it and wondering whether it's any good. So I think part of the message is, I'm trying to say is, like paper-driven development, start to write about it and you'll discover if it's good. And ultimately, the whole, our whole peer review mechanism is a way of discovering, of course, a slightly fallible way, but nevertheless a way of discovering what good is. So I think that's how you discover. I don't think we don't know any better way yet. Yes, please, over there. Do you want to write?
So as a follow-up question on this, if you have too many ideas to write about all of them and you don't know if they're good yet, how do you find the idea you start with?
Oh, well, I think you're a fortunate person if you're so overwhelmed with good ideas that you have too many to write papers about. So you should already be happy with your lot, right? But then I suppose you just have, and I don't know any better way than just picking one and starting to write and develop it, but maybe not overinvest in any one to begin with. Maybe you can start 2 or 3, and then you have to, of course, you're in dialogue with your colleagues in your office and your advisor, maybe. So in this process of dialogue, I wouldn't advise that it's a big bang. You have a big, I'm going to make the choice for the next 5 years of work. No, you just iterate. I'm not sure I can say any more in general than that. Dan.
I want to add something completely different, because you talked about, you're getting the review back and now you're skating review, you're bleeding, but you try to treat it like gold dust. But for all of you, you will be reviewers yourself at some point.
Yes.
So try to be, stick to the facts, be objective, but also encouraging in your review. You don't have to say, "Oh my God, like this is so horrible," right? because think that you will be at the receiving end, right?
Yes, so there's a whole nother talk really in how to write a good review, a review that's truly constructive. But thinking about being constructive, how would I, and also the extent to which your review, the review that you write, contains actionable things. If you just say, this was badly presented and, derivative work, that's not really actionable, right? Whereas if you say, in section 3, I got lost repeatedly, and here are 6 examples, now you don't have to do that for the entire paper, but it's more actionable. That's much more constructive. Yeah.
Simon, thank you for this talk for the students here, but there is a caveat from my point of view in what he's saying, right? Sometimes Simon is very idealistic and he thinks of reviewers as being wise. Sometimes you actually do get bad reviews, right? And reviewers don't understand, right? They make they come with preconceptions to the work and they don't take the time to read carefully.
Yep.
Right? So they might say this is wrong when it's actually right. And if you're interested in this, I can give you some personal experiences offline about this.
You are absolutely right. And I think I think all I can say to that is that I think it is a more common experience to get a review that feels hard, but you can make a lot of constructive out of, than you get a review from somebody who's biased or incompetent. But it does happen, and then for some bits of some reviews, I consciously say I'm not going to act in response to that piece of review because I just don't think I can make the paper better by responding to it. And sometimes it's ignorance, or sometimes it's just, he wanted me to do something that was really a different paper, say. Yes, so the reviewers are not perfect, they're human like you. They're seldom outright manipulative or biased, though that's not impossible either. Yep.
So the goal of the paper. Hello?
Yeah.
The mic keeps turning off.
Testing.
Now it's on, good, yeah.
So the goal of a paper is to transmit an idea, like a spark.
Yeah.
Is it the best way to do that? And what do you think is the best way to do that?
Oh, is a paper the best way to convey a reusable idea into the mind of a reader? Actually, I don't know a better way.
So you think it's like worse than conference talks, better than conference talks?
A conference talk. So I think conference talks are too short to convey many, perhaps even most computer science ideas into the minds of an audience. Right? I think of a talk as being the advertisement for the paper. So you listen to a talk, you think, oh, that sounds really cool. I only understood, 30% of it. Let me go and read the paper. But it's not a substitute for the paper. Very, very seldom. It's quite hard to understand enough from a talk to have any chance of reproducing it, for example. So like a talk ends up with, like 15% of the content of a paper. There's lots of detail and theorems and laid out and figures and specifics that you couldn't possibly do in a talk. So they complement each other. I think it's really helpful to have, the video to accompany the written thing. But a conference paper versus, journal paper or book, I don't know. But I think, our conference format, which are now quite long, 27 pages is a sort of the Popple papers, I tell you, are 27 pages of pretty hardcore stuff. That's quite long. There's quite a lot of words in that. But computer science seems to have got to the point where it's hard to do in 10 pages. So I don't know of a better thing is the answer. Yeah, please. Second. Oh, yes, keep turning it on.
Hello?
Now it's on, yeah.
All right. So you mentioned that your paper should be understandable to the stupidest reader reviewer, but where do you kind of draw the line and say because you don't want to explain everything over again. Where do you draw the line?
So there is a balance here. So I think it's really helpful if you can think of your paper in a way that somebody who isn't an expert or who doesn't want to get into that subject in detail will nevertheless gain something from it from the early sections. So they can, as it were, leave the bus having gained something valuable. So it is certainly true to say that the only people who will persevere right to the end are the ones that are pretty motivated about your idea of a 27-page technical paper, right? That's quite a big commitment. So no, I'm not saying that anybody from, if there's a paper about, differential privacy, right? I'm not saying that somebody from outside that field entirely should be able to completely understand everything with the paper on the first reading, but you just have to know something to be able to appreciate something. But maybe they could understand the first few sections. So it is a judgment call. But for reviewers, you might hope that reviewers have been chosen, that they're from the more expert group at least. So paying attention to where they got stuck is a valuable thing to do, even if you can't satisfy all of them. Yeah.
So speaking about those two sorts of audience, is this on?
Yeah, I think that is on, Phil.
All right, we'll work with
Is it on? Okay, tap it. Yeah.
Yep, certainly on. So speaking of those two sorts of audiences, you know, the people who don't necessarily have the best expert understanding of the situation and the experts, and how you want to start off with something more like high level and that everyone can definitely get something out of, and then you want to get into some detailed, meaty nuts and bolts. What's better, having a gradual sort of a descent into the abyss of details, or something that's
So I suppose there's no right answer to this, right? My general plan is explain the problem, give you an explanation of the problem, then give a kind of intuitive, example-laden exposition of your idea, and then start again with a more, formally based, here's the syntax and here's the semantics and, the sort of a more substantial. So it's like an iterative approach.
Yeah, I suppose I'm wondering, is there another risk of like having a jarring sort of like cutoff in your style there, like in killing the flow?
I hesitate to do this, but have a look at the paper that I'm going to be presenting on Thursday, which is about the verse calculus. It starts off with quite a long section that's pretty informal, right? It's actually quite long, the idea section, section 3, and then it starts again and does, here's a formal rewrite semantics. You can judge whether the transition is jarring. But my experience is that I've not found that to be a problem in practice personally. Yeah, please.
So you talked a lot about like how important it is to have these infectious ideas that ping that are really simple. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of coming up with those ideas. Is it usually the case that you start with something more complicated and then kind of make it simpler and simpler? Or do you try lots of different ideas and find the one that pings the most? Or how do you get to that point of like something that's really good?
Oh, that's a good question, but it's hard to generalize. I would say that for me, Benjamin, Dan, and my colleague at the back, you can think about the answer to this question too, right? So I think for me, it often starts as being more complicated and unprincipled and ad hoc, and there's a process of successively refining. I just can't, it's too embarrassing to explain something this complicated, right? It has to be simpler, even if that means being a bit less ambitious somehow. So then because there's a bit of a dialogue between the problem that you're trying to solve and your solution, you eventually find some kind of sweet spot where the solution is sufficiently simpler that you feel satisfied with it as an explanation. Bit of an iterative process. But for me, it's mostly making the quest for simplicity, coupled with a lot of dialogue and to and fro, very iterative. Is that same for you? Starts complicated, gets simpler. Yep. Very seldom starts simple, gets more complicated. No? Dan, anything? No? It's hard to know because this whole process of ideation, how you get good ideas, is very. I think it's probably different for different people. For me, it's very much about dialogue and conversation with others. For other people, it may just be they go and sit in a dark room with a jar of aspirins for 2 weeks and, magic happens.
I think maybe one thing is that sometimes you want, or often I see students want to solve too difficult a problem.
Yeah.
Like the most general amazing thing, and they come up with a really smart and complex system that's just not, it's not simple. It's not beautiful.
Yeah.
And then I think a great thing to do is make try to solve a simpler problem. Constrain yourself and try to find what's the most beautiful thing that can solve, a lot of what you originally thought of. And I think that's a much better approach to find that crisp key idea.
Did you ever meet Rob Ennals?
Sorry.
Did you ever meet Rob Ennals? I did not. He was a research student that I worked with for some time. Fantastically smart guy, and he would come to me and we would discuss something that he might study, and he would come back a week later and he said, "Well, I looked at that area of ground that you described, and I found a fork mark in it. Somebody had written a paper about it already, so obviously not very interesting." I would say, then he would say, "But look, I found this other area, and no fork marks there." And he would describe it, and I would say, "Rob, there are no fork marks there because it's solid granite." He would say, "Never mind." He would go away for 3 weeks and he would wield his pickaxe and sparks would fly, but in the end, not very much progress would happen. It took quite a lot of time to find a point where he was satisfied to study a problem that was actually soluble. Yeah. Did you have a comment here as well?
So normally what I start with is a very short draft of what my solution would be, and then I just send it to people. I start a dialogue with people. Because that helps me simplify the story. By having to tell the story to people who don't know it, I have to make it as simple as possible. So yeah, I start normally with something a little bit more complex than what I'm hoping for, but not overly complex. It's that conversation that simplifies.
Yeah, I would say, and another question here, thank you. I would say a characteristic of research, I think, for computer science, the quest for simplicity is...
You were just talking about an area where there's not a lot of papers because it's too difficult. So if, I'm thinking of a research topic that doesn't have any research that I can find, should I be discouraged?
I don't think you be discouraged. Maybe, people have just been walking past it. It's all virgin, unmarked soil. But you'll find out because you'll start working on there. But you should maybe just be aware that it could be untouched because it's granite. I'm sure you'll find out. And then it's not your fault if it turns out to be hard. You just move it a little bit to the side.
I mean, but all research has that caveat, right?
All research has that caveat. That, by definition, as we keep saying, we're studying things that are too hard for us. Maybe we should stop at this point, as we seem to have reached the temporary pause, and it's...
Please, let's thank Simon, and then... I want to give away the gift cards. I have to leave after today, so I can't use them myself. So